My family didn't raise me, they groomed me. I wasn't their daughter. I was their insurance policy. The day they tried to break me in public was the day I turned their entire lie into a scandal they'll never erase. Sydney Hale had always believed that the loudest thing about her family was their silence. Raised in a house where love felt like a ledger and affection came with receipts, she had learned to swallow her words early, but nothing prepared her for the moment when her father, Merrick Hale, uttered 6 words that would dismantle her entire existence. "You're just a selfish mistake." The words fell from his lips with the weight of a final verdict, a dismissal of 26 years wrapped in a tone so cold it could have frozen fire. It wasn't rage. It wasn't disappointment. It was worse. It was indifference. That morning, Sydney had stood in a sterile hospital lobby, papers strewn like debris from an emotional explosion. Her mother, Coraline, had made sure every witness saw Sydney's supposed betrayal. Coraline's voice had sliced through the air, accusing Sydney of apathy, of watching her sister Vera die. But this wasn't grief. This was theater, a well-rehearsed play where Sydney was cast as the villain before she even knew her Linus truth was as clinical as it was damning. Sydney had taken a donor compatibility test 6 months prior, long before anyone had asked her to. The results were unequivocal. No match. Not partial. Not marginal. 0 biological compatibility. They knew, or at least, they should have. But guilt was a much sharper blade than facts. And guilt had always been the Hale family's currency. As Sydney picked up the shredded remains of her medical records from the cold hospital floor, she wasn't piecing together paper. She was piecing together her resolve. The day they tried to break her in front of strangers was the day Sydney decided she would never bend again. Every sideways glance from Vera, every venom-laced whisper from Coraline, every silent judgment from Merrick, it all crystallized into a singular truth. Sydney had never been their daughter. She was their insurance policy, a living, breathing contingency plan. But policies expire, and this one was done playing the role they had written for her. By the time she reached the far end of the corridor, the hospital felt less like a sanctuary and more like a stage. She found a quiet corner near the consultation lounge, her fingers trembling only slightly as she scrolled to the email she had buried in her inbox. National donor match results. Confidential. The digital proof of her irrelevance to their bloodline. She forwarded it to Dr. Holstrom, CCing her attorney, Laura Lai. The subject line was clinical, but the intent was not. Sydney wasn't seeking validation. She was preparing for war. Her father's words echoed as she pressed send, but they no longer sliced as deep. Sydney had always believed that the worst betrayal was being ignored. That morning, she learned worse being used. The weight of that realization didn't shatter her. It forged her. The call from Dr. Holstrom came faster than expected. A request cloaked in politeness but edged with urgency. There was an inconsistency in her file. Could she return today? Sydney's response was immediate. On my way. The hospital, once a labyrinth of sterile hallways, now felt like enemy territory. Holstrom's office was dimly lit, the blinds drawn, as if secrecy could soften the impact of what was about to unfold. Holstrom didn't mince words. He gestured to the screen displaying 2 charts side by side. One was Sydney's, one was Vera's. The absence of genetic overlap wasn't just glaring, it was impossible to ignore. You are not biologically related, he said. 6 words that shattered 30 years of familial illusion. Sydney wasn't shocked. Somewhere in the recesses of her mind, she had always suspected. But seeing it quantified, displayed in cold, impersonal data, ignited a storm that no accusation from Coraline could ever match. Truth was not a surprise. It was a liberation. Holstrom offered legal avenues, ethical considerations, but Sydney had already moved past bureaucracy. This wasn't about policies and procedures. This was about reclaiming her existence. She walked out of Holstrom's office with a manila folder pressed against her chest like a shield. Her phone buzzed incessantly, her mother's name flashing like a warning siren. Sydney didn't answer. She didn't need to. The documents in her hands spoke louder than any scream. Sydney found herself back in the hospital's media room, where Coraline had just wrapped a carefully curated gratitude ceremony, painting herself as the martyr mother sacrificing everything for her dying daughter. The banner still hung, the cameras still perched on their tripods. Sydney didn't ask for permission as she approached the podium. She didn't need it, words flowed without tremor. She was done being their scapegoat. With every page she revealed, every forged document she exposed, the narrative shifted. The whispers turned to gasps. Coraline's facade cracked, her desperate interruptions drowned by Sydney's documentation. This wasn't vengeance. This was the truth. Unfiltered and unstoppable. The aftermath was a maelstrom. Headlines screamed Sydney's name, a stark contrast to the anonymity her family had always enforced. Adopted daughter exposes organ donation scandal. Hospital under ethical review. Coraline, once the untouchable matriarch, now faced inquiries that stripped away her cultivated image of sainthood. Merrick, silent and distant, became a relic of a crumbling dynasty. Vera, discharged quietly, vanished from the social media pulpit she once dominated. Sydney didn't bask in the fallout. She watched it from a distance, not with satisfaction, but with clarity. The war had never been about liver matches or medical charts. It had always been about ownership. Her family didn't want to save Vera. They wanted to own Sydney's choices, her body, her silence. But Sydney was no longer their possession. Hospital's legal department extended an olive branch in the form of an apology, laced with legal disclaimers. Sydney didn't need their remorse. She needed their acknowledgement, and now she had it. The truth, once buried under layers of familial guilt, now stood tall, unyielding. A text from Vera arrived unexpectedly. A simple request. Meet. Just us. Sydney agreed, not out of nostalgia, but necessity. Vera sat on a bench outside the hospital, a shadow of her former self. Their conversation was devoid of theatrics. For the first time, they spoke without scripts. Vera's admission wasn't laced with apology, merely confirmation. They only kept you in case I needed something one day. The words didn't wound Sydney. They fortified her. Sydney didn't offer forgiveness. She offered freedom, a silent understanding that bloodlines don't dictate bonds. She left that conversation not with closure, but with conviction. The days that followed were quieter but heavier. Sydney filed for a legal name change. Sydney Hale by choice, not by inheritance. Every signature felt like a reclamation, every notarized page a severing of chains that had bound her for decades. Among the flood of media attention and legal documentation, a letter arrived. No return address. Inside, a simple note in a slanted, unfamiliar hand. A 17-year-old girl, adopted, silenced, and now emboldened by Sydney's story. It wasn't gratitude that filled Sydney's chest, it was purpose. Proof that stories, when spoken aloud, become lifelines for those still drowning in Thea. Sydney recorded a message that night, not for applause, not for validation, but for every soul who had been muted by those who feared their truth. Her voice was steady, resolute. She didn't speak of revenge or justice. She spoke of choice, of reclaiming worth, of shattering the illusion that silence was survival. The war wasn't over, but for Sydney Hale, the battlefield had shifted. She was no longer a pawn in someone else's narrative. She was the author of her own, and her pen was just getting started. Sydney's apartment became a war room. Every surface was covered in documents, media inquiries, and legal correspondence. Laura Lai, her attorney, became both shield and strategist, navigating a storm Sydney had ignited with unwavering precision. The public response was a tidal wave of support mixed with vitriolic backlash. Some hailed Sydney as a whistleblower, a woman who shattered the chains of generational abuse. Others painted her as a bitter opportunist, a narrative pushed by those who had the most to lose. Sydney didn't flinch. She had survived the dissection of her identity. Public opinion was noise in comparison. The hospital's ethics board launched a formal investigation, and for once, the silence of the Hale family worked against them. Coraline's carefully curated persona crumbled under scrutiny, and Merrick's influence, once a looming shadow, receded into irrelevance. Vera, however, was an enigma despite her public fall from grace. Vera maintained a quiet defiance, never acknowledging the storm that had erupted around her. Sydney found herself unexpectedly empathetic. Vera had been groomed into a role as much as Sydney had been used. Their war had been orchestrated by the same hands, their animosity a manufactured distraction from the puppet strings. A second letter arrived, this time from a young man who had witnessed Sydney's press conference. His words mirrored those of the first letter, a silent gratitude for voicing what so many had been forced to bury. Sydney realized that her story was no longer just her own. It had become a catalyst. Legal proceedings were labyrinthine, designed to exhaust and discourage, but Sydney remained relentless. Each deposition, each document subpoenaed was another chisel against the facade her family had constructed. She wasn't just dismantling a lie. She was constructing a foundation for those who would come after her. The media's interest intensified, and with it, the narrative began to shift. Sydney was no longer the disgraced daughter. She was a survivor, an advocate for consent, and autonomy. The courtroom was colder than Sydney expected. Not physically, but in spirit. The trial was not a theatrical affair. It was clinical, methodical. Coraline sat stoically, her once practiced smiles replaced by a tight-lipped resolve. Merrick remained absent, his silence now a glaring admission. Vera was subpoenaed but remained strategically evasive, her testimony a delicate dance of partial truths. Sydney's testimony was not a performance. It was a dissection. Every forged document, every coerced signature, laid bare under oath. Laura's cross-examinations were surgical, dismantling the defense with the precision of a scalpel. The courtroom's sterile atmosphere could not contain the weight of what was unfolding when the verdict was read. It wasn't met with gasps or applause, just a profound silence. Coraline was found guilty of fraud and coercion, her reputation legally dismantled. The hospital faced heavy sanctions. Its systemic failures were exposed for public consumption. Sydney did not celebrate. Victory in this context was a complex, bittersweet triumph. The scars were permanent, but so was the freedom they had carved. Outside the courthouse, Sydney faced a sea of cameras. She didn't deliver a rehearsed statement. She spoke plainly, deliberately. This was never about revenge. It was about truth. And truth, once spoken, cannot be silenced. The crowd responded not with cheers, but with a palpable respect. In the weeks that followed, Sydney continued to receive letters, stories of others who had been silenced, manipulated, and owned. Each letter was a thread, weaving a tapestry of shared resilience. Sydney established a foundation, not for charity, but for empowerment, a space where silence was not a requirement for survival. One evening, as the city pulsed beneath her balcony, Sydney received a call from Vera. It wasn't a plea for forgiveness. It was an acknowledgement. They were no longer adversaries, nor were they sisters. They were survivors of the same war, each carrying different wounds. As the sun dipped below the skyline, Sydney reflected on the journey. She had been raised as a contingency plan, a living safety net. But now, She was an architect of her narrative. The Hale name, once a shackle, had become a banner under which she rallied others. Sydney Hale was no longer a footnote in someone else's story. She was the headline. And this time, she was writing every word.